Everyone, Judge Andrew Napolitano here for Judging Freedom. Today is Friday, April 10th, 2026. It's our favorite day of the week. It's our favorite time of the day. It's the Intelligence Community Roundtable with Larry Johnson and with our dear friend and colleague Scott Ritter filling in for the traveling Ray McGovern. Larry, to you first. Is there a ceasefire involving Iran, the United States, and Israel?
I would say not officially. They have ceased firing for now between U.S. and Israel. Have conducted no attacks against Iran in the last 36 hours, almost 48 hours. The remaining issue that's outstanding is whether or not Israel will admit and the United States will admit that there is also a ceasefire for Lebanon. Iranians have been very, very clear. They're unyielding on this. If there is no ceasefire for Lebanon, they're going to walk out. They are not going to sit down, and they're not going to have this indirect negotiations with the United States. They're also demanding that the sanctions be lifted now, not in the future, no promise down the road, now, and that the assets that have been frozen, that those are released. So Iran's not backing off of that. And so the good news is over the last 48 hours, there have been no more bombings in Iran. But Israel went out of its way to try to sabotage the thing on Wednesday when they killed more than 300 civilians, women, children. It was horrific.
Scotty, what is your understanding of the issue with Lebanon? Who's being honest? Who's being sincere? Who's being deceptive?
There was an agreement reached in principle before it became publicly announced between the United States and Iran, brokered by Pakistan, where that the ceasefire included Lebanon. Everybody understood that to be the case. It was understood by President Trump when he called Benjamin Netanyahu. But the Israelis informed the president that this would create a political problem for them because, Hezbollah got involved in the conflict 5 days after the conflict began. So, and the Israelis are treating the conflict with Hezbollah as a completely separate conflict, an ongoing conflict. Israel mobilized troops. They have a separate Lebanon policy. Right now, they're trying to implement to advance deep into southern Lebanon, then to annex the totality of that territory into Israel. This is part of their, national security strategy, so to speak. And so to suddenly have Lebanon linked to the, comprehensive peace agreement that the United States is seeking with Iran, that was disconcerting, politically impossible for the Israelis to accept up front. And so political games had to be played. Netanyahu rejected that. Trump then, the U.S. pretended that Trump had thrown away these 10 points, and Vance had to go out and say this was a mistake on the part of the Iranians. And this could have been done under the misguided belief that Iran would say, "Oh gosh, you're right. We don't." We don't insist on this, but the Iranians, stood their ground, insisted. The Pakistanis came out very strongly, condemning the Pakistani Minister of Defense, condemned the Israelis in very harsh language. The Pakistani president called the United States liars and said without any shadow of doubt that this was an agreement. And ultimately, the United States, my understanding is that Israel has in fact acknowledged that the ceasefire will extend to Lebanon because that is the only political dynamic that can exist. This is going to require Israel to, have to,
grow,
eat things it doesn't want to eat. But they have no choice in this matter. Israel started this war. Israel is the one that on February 11th briefed the president on the ease in which this war could be won through regime change, suppression of missiles. The head of Mossad was there, giving the president intelligence briefings that were different from what he was getting from his own American advisors. The president went with the Israeli information. And so Netanyahu doesn't have too many cards that he's holding with his president right now. He's been embarrassed, disgraced, and the president had to buy him some political room. And that's what happened. There had to be a time for the Israelis to adjust to this new reality. But now, at the insistence of the United States, Israel acknowledges that this ceasefire extends to Lebanon.
Here's Larry. Here's the vice president doing his lying best. Chris, number 22.
I actually think, and there's a lot of bad faith negotiation and a lot of bad faith, propaganda going on. I think this comes from a legitimate misunderstanding. I think the Iranians thought that the ceasefire included Lebanon, and it just didn't. We never made that promise. We never indicated that was going to be the case. What we said is that the ceasefire would be focused on Iran, and the ceasefire would be focused on America's allies, both Israel and the Gulf Arab states. That said, the Israelis, as I understand it, again, I'm supposed to get a fuller report when I get on the plane, have actually offered to be, frankly, to check themselves a little bit in Lebanon because they want to make sure that our negotiation is successful. That's not because that is part of the ceasefire. I think that's the Israelis trying to set us up for success, and we'll, of course, see how that unfolds in the next few days. But look, if Iran wants to let this negotiation fall apart in a conflict where they were getting hammered over Lebanon, which has nothing to do with them and which the United States never once said was part of the ceasefire, that's ultimately their choice. We think that would be dumb, but that's their choice.
That is profoundly untrue, the last part of that statement, isn't it, Larry?
Yeah, but hey, this become the hallmark of the Trump administration. If you ain't lying, you ain't trying. Okay, so I mean, look, the United States has been desperately seeking a ceasefire since mid-March because of the economic fallout. Now, there are some around. There is a clearly established pattern of corruption within the Trump administration. He comes out on a Sunday, Monday, or Tuesday, like he did this week. So it's always in the first of the week where he either said, we're going to destroy them, and then like an hour and a half before the markets open, he'll say, oh, we've got a great opportunity for peace. It's going to be settled. Man, the price of oil starts falling. The stock market starts soaring. They've done that 4 times so far. And they just did it Tuesday. And what they're saying is not true. These people on Wall Street are idiots that they buy into this nonsense. Look, Iran was not the one seeking for a ceasefire. Iran's quite content. Yeah, they've gotten hit. They've suffered. The Israelis blew up a railroad, a Chinese-built railroad 4 or 5 days ago, and guess what? Iran finished rebuilding it today. So they're not wasting any time. You blow it up, we're going to rebuild it. So this is Iran's ready to continue to have the global economy in a chokehold. And anybody that's watched any kind of mixed martial arts knows that a chokehold can kill you. It can cut off the flow of blood to the brain, and what it is cut off the flow of oil. But some interesting things are going on behind the scenes now. Japan is sending a bunch of tankers. Apparently, they've cut a deal with Iran. They're going to get to sell a bunch of tankers into the Persian Gulf, load up on some Iranian oil, and sell back. And despite the United States said, but wait, you're our ally. And it's now every man or every country for themselves.
Scotty, what did the United States gain from the 6 weeks of bombing?
Nothing. This was a huge strategic error on the part of the president, and a huge political error on his part too. Let me make it clear to everybody, and I know this is going to drive people insane. We didn't lose this war from a military standpoint, because we never fully engaged in this war. This was an air war, but the United States has escalation potential, but it's politically unviable. And so long as we remember that this is all about November, this whole war was about November. This war was a gambit on the part of Trump and his cabal of peace through strength aficionados to, this was going to be the 1, 2, 3 punch. Venezuela, Maduro's head; Iran, Khamenei's head; Then we meet with Xi Jinping, and we throw those two heads on the table, and we say, now, when we talk about the Pacific, you have to take us seriously. And the Chinese were supposed to quake and quell and surrender. We got the Venezuela part down, but Iran failed. Xi Jinping, we pulled out of the talks because we no longer had the foundation to talk with China. And in the meantime, the entire world's changed. I mean, I call this an empire terminating event. You talked about the Japanese sending tankers down. You know that there was a tripartite framework agreement between Japan, South Korea, and the United States confronting North Korea and posturing to contain Russia and contain China. Where we talked about nuclear submarines and we talked about nuclear warfighting, sharing plans, et cetera. All premised on the notion that America was going to be there to back everybody up. Well, the missile defense shield that we had put over South Korea, THAAD, Patriot 3, didn't work. And then we got rid of it. We broke it down, sent it off to Israel to replace the one that didn't work the first time around. The South Koreans and the Japanese right now, this tripartite framework agreement's finished. The United States can guarantee nothing. Japan understands how fragile and vulnerable they are economically, because if the United States can't guarantee the opening of the Strait of Hormuz, what about the Straits of Malacca down in Indonesia? What about the South China Sea where China has those islands? Japan just woke up to the fact that the United States isn't there to, if they continue to ally themselves, they're not going to get stronger. They're going to get weaker. Look at AUKUS, Australia, United Kingdom, U.S., another big, Pacific-oriented relationship. First of all, the UK's out. Starmer said, I'm done with America. So it's now AUS. And the Australians, they're done. They have the same problem as the Japanese, that the United States can guarantee nothing. We don't care about Australia. If we cared, we would have consulted. We didn't consult. And now they're going through an energy crisis. This is the NATO. NATO is just about finished. I mean, we're talking, the president and DeMarco, we were talking about pulling out 100,000 troops. And we're talking about being selective in terms of whom we support. That's the end of, collective defense. All of our strategic relationships that defined who and what we were geopolitically for the past 40 years, they're gone. They're finished. They're done, especially in the Gulf Arab states. It's over. So this is a huge strategic defeat for the United States. It goes beyond simply, what's going on with Iran. But the Iran picture, because everything I just said, the American people don't understand, Judge. I'm just sorry to say that they don't. I just finished talking to somebody who was like, this is the end of Trump. He's going to lose the November election. I said, dude, if you think you can call an American election in November, in April, you know nothing about American politics. American politics is where the American people are in September, and the American people aren't driven by what's going on around the world. They're driven by their pocketbook. It's the economy, stupid. That's the lesson Bill Clinton gave us. And this president has time to turn things around and put on a con game to get things where he wants them, but not if we're bogged down in a forever war in the Middle East. He has to get out of this war.
Larry, how critical to the U.S. Determination to end the violence was the failed effort to seize Iranian enriched uranium last week?
I don't really think that factored in much. I mean, it was a consideration that, we still don't have the straight story about what was going on. Scott and I were together yesterday, and we talked about it. There's just a lot that doesn't add up and in the story, but that that wasn't the one they said, okay, now we got to get a ceasefire. It's true that we lost 480, let's call it $500 million worth of aircraft was lost in those 2 days from Saturday through Sunday. That's a pretty expensive bill. That's the largest loss of aircraft since Vietnam War. The thing I want to go back to what Scott was saying, because if you saw yesterday, the opposition candidate for Taiwan showed up in China for a visit, and so she's a very tall, good-looking woman, and she comes off the aircraft, and the embraces, the exchanges with the Chinese were very warm. They were not this official standoff. I mean, it was like, hey, buddy, how you doing? Good to see you. And she was talking about making a visit to Taiwan. that was announced after that. So what we're seeing, I think, here is a growing recognition, not only by China, but by Taiwan and the allies that had trusted the United States. They've seen the United States fail now twice militarily. And when I say fail, yeah, we got a Navy, but what good is it? Because if the country's got hypersonic missiles, that Navy has to stay offshore, which sort of defeats the idea of having a Navy, because
Right.
you want to get an aircraft carrier up close to the combat aircraft off that deck and can penetrate into the interior. But now they got to stay offshore. The Marines, they like to they get their landing craft. I guess this was an LHA, the Tripoli, and it got close to shore and it started getting lit up with drones and missiles, so it backed off. So they're watching the United States, who promised, oh, we got your back. You want to align with us because we're the biggest, toughest, baddest guy on the block. And then look at what's happened to the Gulf.
Right.
Already Oman and Qatar have said, we're with you guys. They're signing on with Iran. It'll be up to see what UAE and Saudi Arabia do.
Scotty, how badly was Israel battered, and in what kind of shape is Netanyahu in?
Well, to be frank, I don't know exactly how battered they are because there's been effective censorship. But enough information has gotten out that the implication is they've been hit harder than they've ever been hit before. In that this was becoming a political problem for Benjamin Netanyahu. The Israelis always said going in that they can absorb a finite amount of damage, and they're willing to raise that parameter up as much as is politically viable, if and only if, and this is the important part, if and only if the guaranteed outcome is the end of the regime and no more missiles and no more nuclear program. They're not going to get any of those. And so now Netanyahu pushed for this war. He's the one who went and sold this war to President Trump.
Right.
He's the one who put the reputation of Israel on the line. And everything he said turned out to be a lie, to be false, be overhyped. As General Kane said, the Israelis tend to oversell everything, and we should be very careful with what they're saying. But Trump wasn't careful, and we went to war on behalf of Israel, for Israel, using Israeli intelligence. And now we failed. Israel's not going to get anything it wanted. There will be no regime change. The regime is stronger today. The missiles, they're there. Iran's not giving them up. And, the nuclear program, Iran will strike a compromise deal that allows enrichment, and that's politically untenable. So, Netanyahu is in a lot of trouble. I think tomorrow his criminal trial begins. And the thinking that the United States is going to fly cover for this guy after he got us involved in this war. I think we're looking, it's hard. You got to be careful when you talk about the demise of Benjamin Netanyahu because he's been such a political survivor for so long. But right. I've always said that the only way after October 7th, 2023, he stays in power is to continue to escalate conflict. That the only thing he has to sell the Israeli people is that he's the security guy. He's the national security guy, that there will be no security without him. Well, he just failed in the final test. The regimes of Iran's there. And remember, this is the war he's been pushing for a long time. He's been saying, we can't take Iran out without the help of the United States. Well, we went in all in. I mean, we put all the chips down there. We said, let's go. And we lost. We didn't get it. So Netanyahu is in a lot of trouble, a whole bunch of trouble.
Larry, the Monday edition of The Economist magazine, which is a fairly credible and reliable international source, says clearly and without hesitation, the United States lost and Iran won. And Iran is in a stronger position now than it was before Trump's bombing. Don't you agree?
Oh, yeah. And that's a pretty impressive statement coming out, as I recall. I think The Economist was or still is owned by the Rothschilds.
Right.
Yeah. So when they're ponying that up, look, I think we saw the New York Times had an article out earlier this week explaining how the title was how Israel drove the United States to war. And I read that article, not so much for all the in and outs of who said what, but really to look at it and say, okay, who's going to be the scapegoat? Okay, so the villains in the article were Israel, Bibi Netanyahu and David Barnea, the Mossad chief, for lying to the United States. You had J.D. Vance, Marco Rubio, and to a lesser extent, General Raisin Kane pushing back on it. And Ratcliffe, John Ratcliffe, the CIA director. So
Ratcliffe was apparently quite critical of Barnea, and he may have been critical afterwards when the Times got these quotes. Anyway, sorry for interrupting you.
It was, and apparently Marco Rubio used Ray McGovern's expression about male bovine excrement in reference to what the Israelis were predicting. Now, the one that was clearly identified as the American scapegoat, Pete Hegseth. Man, he was like, oh, gung-ho, and he was pushing for it. But ultimately also the one that holds the responsibility that gets blamed in that article for doing this, Donald Trump. Because they've got in their explicit paragraph saying he was told, in no uncertain terms, that, Iran's likely to shut down the Gulf of Hormuz. And he was like, no, they're not going to do that. So, when the media, like I said, when you've got a Rothschild's magazine putting that out, and then you got the New York Times, who's been also favorably disposed, and they're identifying the scapegoats because they recognize when the blame game starts, and Trump's not going to take the blame. You're going to.
Well, he's probably going to fire. Scotty, I would think he would have to fire Hegseth. He's got to blame somebody. Some head has to roll. It's not going to be his.
Judge, let me just make one other observation, though. What the war is going bad when they trot out Melania to do an Epstein presentation.
Who knew that Melania was accused of anything? Her denial received far more publicity than whatever she claimed to have been denying. Scotty, how could they not have thought that Hormuz would be closed? How could they not have planned for that?
Well, first of all, the military has planned for it. I mean, we have the Fifth Fleet right there, whose job is to keep the Strait of Hormuz open. I know for a fact that the Fifth Fleet in the 1990s believed that they could keep the Strait of Hormuz open. They believed that we had sufficient power to do that, but that was before Iran transitioned into, the military posture that it enjoys today. It's area denial munitions, it's missiles. This changes the entire dynamic. Our Navy is not capable of forcing the Strait of Hormuz. We would lose our fleet. And this is something that has been apparent for more than a decade now. And known, the Navy knows this. I mean, there's a lot of political blustering. You always see an admiral, we guarantee within X amount of time, if the Iranians try to shut it, we'll have it back open. But anybody who studies it would say, no, you don't. No, you can't. No, you won't. So this was a known. But again, the president, deals with, it's not that we couldn't, I don't think the issue of forcing the Strait of Hormuz came up because the scenario the Israelis played out was regime change will create the conditions in which we won't have to discuss the Strait of Hormuz.
Right.
Just like we won't have to discuss Iran's ability to sustain ballistic missile launches. If we change the regime, all of these other issues become moot. And so from Donald Trump's perspective, having embraced the Israeli posture, you didn't have to worry about the Strait of Hormuz because we were going to topple this regime. That's where he says that, he was taken by surprise. We didn't think the Iranians would be able to do it. Not that they, weren't planning on doing it. They couldn't do it. He just didn't believe that the regime would last long enough to be able to pull it off.
Yeah. Larry, doesn't Iran have enormous leverage in Islamabad now as they begin to negotiate, with the vice president who's new to all this, and B, with these two clowns that tricked them in June and in February? I'm surprised the Iranians would even permit them to be there, Witkoff and Kushner. But before we talk about Witkoff and Kushner, doesn't Iran have the stronger hand?
Yeah, no, they do. They don't need the ceasefire. Donald Trump does, as Scott was pointing out earlier. This is all about November, and He can't afford. It's not so much the saying we won or lost the war per se. It is more what is happening to the global economy. What will happen to the global economy? We just got the report today. Inflation was up already 3% in the United States, and that's not even beginning to touch what's actually happening. But they have to say, yeah, that's bad. We've got more inflation. That inflation's going to grow. We're going to have recession tied in with inflation. It's called stagflation. Last time we saw that was about 50 years ago in the 70s. That's not a good record to go into an election with. So this is the problem they've got with these negotiations is that it's still indirect. I just read that the Iranians are going to be in one room, the Americans will be in another, and
who goes back and forth? The Pakistani people?
Yeah, Pakistani guy. So hopefully he's been at the gym this last week working out. Getting ready to for the exercise, running back and forth. But the reality is, the United States is desperate to sell a product, and Iran, they don't need the product. They're quite happy where they're at. And I'm not saying they're happy with being attacked, but they recognize they are now taken in a serious fashion like they'd never been before in the last 46 years. They are, and they're seizing the moment.
Wow. Scotty, your thoughts before we close.
Again, as long as we keep this, war is an extension of politics by other means. That's just straight up Sun Tzu, Clausewitz, and anybody else who ever studied war. And as long as we keep this political paradigm in place where it, as Larry said, it's all about November 7th, then Iran holds all the cards. But the Iranians have to be careful here because the president can't make all the compromises that Iran wants. Iran will have to give something back. And I know, they're winning and they've won and all that, but Iran, it's the same thing, the same dynamic we've seen with Russia, Ukraine, and NATO. Everybody's out there saying, Russia sets a red line, it gets crossed, Russia looks weak, Russia, the NATO's expanding. There's only one winner in this conflict right now, and it's Russia. And the reason why Russia is winning is that Russia kept the political dynamic the way it always was. Russia never changed the political dynamic. They managed escalation. And as a result, they weren't bogged down. They didn't change the political dynamic. And now they're dominating, the world on all fronts when it comes to energy and geopolitics, et cetera, because they kept it the same. The Iranians need to keep their eye on the ball. Right now, they're winning because of the political dynamic. But the moment you turn this into a situation where, Trump no longer is focused on November, if you make it so that November is an impossibility no matter what, then the political dynamic changes. There are things that the United States can't do right now militarily because to escalate would harm the political reality of November. You take November away, mobilization's on the table. That now you turn this into an existential struggle where the president can sell it as such to the American people. Then we no longer have a cap on escalation, and we can escalate through. And this is where the Iranians have to be very, very careful. Israel has an absolute red line that Iran cannot have a pathway to a nuclear bomb, which means that Iran is going to have to accept limitations on its nuclear program that probably mirror that agreement which was made before the United States and Israel began to bomb. Now, there are people out there saying Iran will never go back to that agreement because they were bombed. No, Iran will go back to that agreement because that's its only chance. Because if Iran insists on having an agreement like the JCPOA or better, that gives them a path to a nuclear bomb because it means unrestricted enrichment. That won't happen. So the Iranians are in the driver's seat right now, but they can still screw this up if they overplay their hand.
Guys, thank you very much. Larry, Scott, third time for both of you this week on Judging Freedom. I know I owe you both a nice dinner. Larry says, no, you don't. Scott says, this Marine is eating.
Yeah. I'm hungry, baby.
Yeah.
We'll see you guys next week. Thank you. All the best.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. And coming up on Monday, of course, Alistair Crook Larry Johnson, Ray McGovern, and probably Scott Ritter. And
ਅੱਜ ਕਾਲਜ ਹੋ ਗਿਆ ਬੰਦ ਕੁੜੀਏ, ਅੱਜ ਕਾਲਜ ਹੋ ਗਿਆ ਬੰਦ ਕੁੜੀਏ, ਨਾ ਵਿੱਚ ਬਾਜ਼ਾਰਾਂ ਲੰਘ ਕੁੜੀਏ, ਨਾ ਵਿੱਚ ਬਾਜ਼ਾਰਾਂ ਲੰਘ ਕੁੜੀਏ। आजा मेरे कोल ठंडा पानी पियाल सा, जो तेरी मर्जी ओयो मंगाल सा। ना हो गर्मी विच तंग कुड़िए, ना हो गर्मी विच तंग कुड़िए, अज कालज हो गया बंद कुड़िए, अज कालज हो गया बंद कुड़िए। इस गर्मी विच किया तू सड़ती, पानी पी पी किया तू मरदी। इस गर्मी विच किया तू सड़ती, पानी पी पी किया तू मरदी। आ छां विच बैठा संग कुड़िए, आ छां विच बैठा संग कुड़िए, ना बीच बाजारां लंघ कुड़िए, अज कालज हो गया बंद कुड़िए, ना बीच बाजारां लंघ कुड़िए। सुन नीले तले विच बैठ मेरे कोल वे, मैं भी कुछ बोला कुछ तू बोल वे। सुन नीले तले विच बैठ मेरे कोल वे, मैं भी कुछ बोला कुछ तू बोल वे। एवें खल्लिए तू जिवें पीती भंग कुड़िए, एवें खल्लिए तू जिवें पीती भंग कुड़िए, ना बीच बाजारां लंघ कुड़िए, ना बीच बाजारां लंघ कुड़िए, अज कालज हो गया बंद कुड़िए, अज कालज हो गया बंद कुड़िए, ना बीच बाजारां लंघ कुड़िए, ना बीच बाजारां लंघ कुड़िए। इस गर्मी विच किया तू सड़दी, पानी पी पी किया है मरदी। इस गर्मी विच किया तू सड़दी, पानी पी पी किया है मरदी। आ छां विच बैठा संग कुड़िए, आ छां विच बैठा संग कुड़िए, ना बीच बाजारां लंघ कुड़िए, ना बीच बाजारां लंघ कुड़िए, अज कालज हो गया बंद कुड़िए, अज कालज हो गया बंद कुड़िए, ना बीच बाजारां लंघ कुड़िए, ना बीच बाजारां लंघ कुड़िए, ना बीच बाजारां लंघ कुड़िए। सुन नीले तले विच बैठ मेरे कोल वे, मैं भी कुछ बोला कुछ तू बोल वे। सुन नीले तले विच बैठ मेरे कोल वे, मैं भी कुछ बोला कुछ तू बोल वे। एवें खल्ली है तू जिवें पीती भंग कुड़िए, एवें खल्ली है तू जिवें पीती भंग कुड़िए, ना बीच बाजारां लंघ कुड़िए, ना बीच बाजारां लंघ कुड़िए, अज कालज हो गया बंद कुड़िए, अज कालज हो गया बंद कुड़िए, ना बीच बाजारां लंघ कुड़िए, ना बीच बाजारां लंघ कुड़िए, ना बीच बाजारां लंघ कुड़िए।